All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 3 of Designing Learning Through Learning Design class. It's our final week, and we're going to be talking about design thinking. And with us today, we have John Vines, who is working at the Open Lab at Newcastle University and is a specialist in designing things. So, John, why don't you tell us a few things about you, and then maybe a few things about design thinking as well.
Yeah, no worries. Well, thanks a lot for that, Hannah. So as Hannah said, I'm a designer by background. So my training was in product design, and this is going back 10 to 15 years ago now. So my training was actually I learned a load of different practical design making and craft skills. So my training was a bit of metalwork, a bit of woodwork. So I learned interesting things such as how to cut down trees and make fresh green wood into furniture, and wood that would change shape and form over time as the wood dried out, and also basic model making and 3D modeling skills on computers. But this is all fairly typical stuff for a product designer. And then in 2005, when I was finishing my degree, I actually started to get quite fed up with just making things in response to a brief that someone else had set. And it certainly seemed at that time anyway that pretty much all the work that a design graduate could get would be like that. I was also getting a bit fed up of just making things and not necessarily having the space to think about why we make them as well. So in 2005 I decided to do a master's, and this included my first time doing what I felt was real research. And I'd started at that time to become quite interested in design for older people and aging. And basically my time on my master's involved me spending quite a lot of time with older people and retirees, talking to them about technology. And I developed some alternatives to the types of digital systems that were quite commonplace about 10 years ago, that better met their needs. And then after I finished my master's, I became even more frustrated with making things. And then during my PhD, which I did for the 3 years after that, I basically just stood back from the practice of designing and making quite a lot, and instead actually studied what it was designers actually do when they work in interdisciplinary teams. But then possibly because I became quite, I had this distance for a few years. When I finished my PhD, because I had spent a lot of time doing a lot of reading, a lot of observing, a lot of writing, but not really much doing, when I finished my PhD, I suddenly got quite excited by the idea of coming back to making things. So I was very lucky at the end of 2010. I got a postdoctoral researcher position up here in Newcastle, where I've been ever since. And to begin with, I started working on a project which was all about developing new types of banking and financial technologies for people over the age of 80. And this project was all about looking at issues of financial inclusion and digital inclusion. And it was all about the issues of how.
Yes, what happened?
I am getting my own voice in my head from about 20 seconds ago.
Mm-hmm.
Does that happen, Hannah?
No, that's a bug. One of the things that you can do is dial in and out, but before you do that, you can also disconnect your headphones and reconnect your headphones. One of those two things will work.
Issues of financial inclusion, and that didn't work. Shall I go out and back in?
Yep.
It might also make sense to close your browser and reopen it.
Yeah. And this reminds me lots about the show IT Crowd. Has any of you guys seen it?
Did you turn it off and turn it on again?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
It's still very busy here.
Yeah, I can see. That's really good. Give us a tour of the new Open Lab.
I'm using the camera in my display, so I can't walk around too much. I'm on the 4th floor.
Yeah.
Oh, John's back.
All right, we have John. You're
Yeah,
getting a quick digital tour.
really sorry about that. I have no idea. That was the freakiest thing ever. Shall I just carry on?
Yep.
Okay. So yeah. So where was this? So I started doing this project, which was all around banking technologies and issues to do with financial inclusion and digital exclusion. And it was really looking at the ways in which, first of all, what's the challenge of how do we support older people to manage their finances, to access their money, and to make payments to other people in a time when banking services are becoming increasingly mediated by digital stuff, basically. But what was really interesting for me with this project was that it wasn't actually about designing for this age group. It was actually all about designing with them. So this was the first time I really became engaged with what is usually called co-design or participatory design. And this basically means working with people who will be affected by any design decisions that you're going to make right from the very start of your design process. So although this project was only 12 months long for me, during this time I ran workshop after workshop with 80-year-olds and 90-year-olds where we'd have lots of cups of tea, lots of lovely conversations about quite intimate details about their financial histories and the types of things they pay and how they manage their money. But quite often as well, we do design activities together, creative activities, where we'd be looking at developing with them alternative ideas and concepts for the types of technologies that they might experience in the near future. And I suppose, for me, I guess it's this participatory approach that probably best describes the type of design work that I do now, which is typically working with groups of people, working with communities, defining with them and exploring personal or shared problems, actually not assuming what the issues are before you start working with a group and working with them to kind of define what these challenges are. And then with them looking at quite new and radical interactive and digital technologies and identifying the ways in which these might positively or even sometimes negatively impact on their lives, and often giving them the skill sets and the knowledge to make design decisions themselves. And I guess in my research, I do this in a whole range of areas still, from personal health. We do a lot of work in the context of social care and community activism and local democracy. But primarily the area of work that I still work in is technology for older people and technology for aging. So that's a bit of an introduction to myself there. I would say probably when it comes to thinking about design thinking, and actually in a way design thinking is actually a concept that I have a bit of a problem with. But that's because some people, not everyone by any means, but certainly some people often attribute design thinking as some sort of innate, untouchable quality that only certain types of creative people might have. And I think the Tim Brown TED talk that you sent round, Hannah, was quite interesting in that, because he talks a lot about design, the qualities of designers almost, but also he talks about how creativity and designerly thinking can be something that everyone can have at some level. But I think you've got to take these types of things quite seriously, because an awful lot of people do feel as though they're not creative people. I've done a lot of research with people where I run co-design sessions, and the first things that quite a lot of people would say is that, oh, I'm not a creative person, or that person over there, she's so creative, it puts me to shame, or that I have no good ideas. And sometimes I think it's because people think of creativity or designing as being able to draw, or as being able to be a little bit loopy or expressive or artistic. But the types of things that I like to believe is that actually everyone can be creative and anyone can be a designer to a degree. And often when I'm working with people who maybe don't initially think they're very creative, I initially start to point out to them how actually there's little things that they do that are really actually very, very creative and quite designerly. So for example, I'm quite lucky that in a lot of the work that I do, people who take part in my research invite me to their homes in order to be interviewed or to talk to them about a study. And then just looking around people's homes, you see the ways in which their furniture and ornaments have been organised in really quirky and interesting ways, how objects have been appropriated within the home to do things that the designer never intended them to be used for. And you see things like old broken remote controls that have been elegantly fixed with pieces of old sellotape or with rubber bands. And for me, although these are kind of things that are quite commonplace and sometimes quite spontaneous, they are kind of acts of design. And I think we should really appreciate this type of do-it-yourself mentality and highlight it, because for me it's an example of how creativity is already always going on all around us. And I think, as Tim Brown said in that TED talk as well, design is something that's actually too important to be left just to designers. And I think in some respects this is already happening all around us actually, but sometimes designers can be blind to it. Is that okay as an intro? Oh, we
Can't hear you, Hannah.
can't hear you, Hannah.
How about now?
Can hear you now.
Yes? Good?
We can hear. Well, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think it would be good to just make sure that everyone understands what design thinking is and how is design thinking different from designing, and I guess from common sense. So I guess for me the definition is that when you design something, you just look at it in a very kind of limited. There is an element that doesn't work, and you need to design how to make it work. And design thinking is looking more holistically about who are the people, why are they doing the things that they are doing, and not only kind of look at the symptoms, of a disease and give a pill that's going to cure that, but instead just look holistically at like the general health of a system and propose a solution that better solves the challenge that someone is trying to do. Is that fair? Does that make sense to everyone?
It makes sense completely to me. I would say that, so I think kind of my view would be that acts of design go on everywhere, but design thinking is what you're talking about, is this more holistic, systemic view of thinking through the consequences of the actions of the things that you might be designing or creating or putting out there for people to live with.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to open up the floor to questions, but to not take you by surprise, you can come up with your own questions. I already have one that actually relates to everything that you have said so far. So actually, I'm quite interested in this concept of people rejecting creativity as a value that characterizes them, and I find it fascinating. And for me, I had similar experiences when I was teaching art to adolescent boys in Dubai, and they were completely rejecting art. I'm not an artist. This is not a value that I'm willing to admit that I have. But I don't think that it's an issue that's related to them. It's like most people. It's almost perceived as a minority of people has this gift to be creative, and I completely disagree with this. But the question that I have is, why is design thinking, other than for that reason that creativity is kind of rejected? Why do you think it's not the norm? Why do you think that people tend to, try to solve like little parts of a problem instead of looking holistically at a whole system? Like, why did Tim have to do this TED Talk, and why do you think it's such a popular TED Talk? Is it actually a problem that no one is doing design thinking?
Well, I think a lot of people are doing design thinking, but I think how I think part of the challenge here is that actually design thinking is really very hard. It's very hard, particularly in the way in which Tim Brown talks about it. And some of the examples that he uses in that talk are really good, quite large scale and very ambitious projects where design thinking has been introduced. But even those projects themselves have a particular scale to them, and actually it's quite difficult to do things on a really, really big scale using design thinking. And that's not just because it's difficult to actually practically do, but also we live in a world where there's lots of competing priorities. There's lots of politics involved as well. And sometimes it's really challenging just to actually get everyone to kind of come to some sort of consensus and to get all of the different factors in place in order to kind of get this system thinking really played out in any sort of practice. And I think that's why actually, if we think of design thinking, when some of the really good examples I know of are some of the there's been some really interesting design for crime initiatives. So these are things that are normally being integrated on a local authority level, and that's because one singular local authority that might be managing one part of a city could probably implement one set of new services and processes itself. But as soon as you start to try and think about it at the scale of counties, countries, worldwide, it becomes really, really problematic because more and more bureaucracies, more and more organisations get influenced. So I think there's lots of people doing it. I just think there's not maybe at the moment quite still the degree of people doing it at the the grand scale.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have any questions about design thinking, creativity?
I have one. Which way would be the best to teach everyone that he's a designer, or like what do you see as the best mean to make people realize that they can design?
So the first thing I would never do is tell them that you're going to teach them design, because I think that's kind of what you were saying there, Hannah. As soon as you try to teach someone art who really doesn't identify with being artistic or creative, or maybe there's an identity issue going on there, or you don't necessarily want to make that explicit. But the types of things I do, so it's never about reinventing the wheel. You can make use of lots of really simple tools and techniques that already exist out there. So some of the techniques that I've used, I've done, say, a lot of workshops, not just with kind of older people and young people and involve them in a design process, but also just with teenagers who just want to learn a little bit about engaging with design. And there's lots of really interesting, very simple toolkits out there, such as the business model generation toolkit, the value proposition design canvas. There's a toolkit called development, impact, and you. And what all of these are essentially are they're organizational strategy and entrepreneurship tools, which really are about kind of helping organizations think about the products and the services that they might be proposing to potential customers. But they're really interesting because what they ask you to do, and these are very simple templates which you can print off on any old printer, and on a piece of paper you start to fill them out in groups and in teams, and they start to force you to make lots of quick but quite significant decisions around, first of all, who your user group would be in response to, say, a particular problem or particular issue that you've identified, what their values are, what they might be motivated by, and then you start to map out kind of what their individual challenges are in their life. And simple tools like this are a really, really useful starting point to get people to think about, first of all, people other than themselves, and then to think about what are other people's challenges, and then thinking through not necessarily creative responses, but actually thinking about solutions or ways of tackling some of the challenges that certain groups of people might have. And I've used these types of toolkits with, as I say, kind of school children in their teenage years, but also through to students on master's programs who maybe have come from completely different disciplines and have no experience with design at all. So that's, for me, like a really useful starting point is starting to think through those issues.
That's it'd be great actually if you could then maybe send the names of these toolkits, because they all sound rather useful. And you actually mentioned that's very interesting. You mentioned entrepreneurship, because when you talk about participatory design, you obviously talk about almost like a democratic way to approach and solve an issue. And I think that this kind of collaboration, talking to people whose meet you're going to help, is one way of looking at it. But the completely other approach is the kind of totalitarian entrepreneurship approach, where you just roll in with an idea and you have one person saying, this is my idea, this is what I believe in, I have been looking at people, I have been talking to people, and I have been experimenting with things, and I think this works, so I'm going to build it, I'm going to make it happen, and it will solve everyone's issues. And I actually have to say that it does seem to work pretty well. If we look at Uber, someone had a crazy idea, they were willing to go to war with everyone, all the constituents around them, to really meet the needs of just one constituent, but the biggest group of constituents, which are people using cabs. And it is successful. But it's, if you try to solve this through a consulting project of all the parties, I don't think it would have been possible. So how, because of the politics of the business. So how do you look at this, entrepreneurship versus democratic decision making in design thinking?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So yeah, I imagine if you had proposed to a group of potential customers the Uber app as a design prototype or something like that, then I don't know how many people have actually said, oh yeah, I'd really like that. Sometimes it really needs this type of stuff to be driven forward and pushed forward. So I don't think I necessarily have a straight answer for you with that one, I'm afraid, Hannah. I think what I would say is that I think there's kind of a meeting point halfway between, where you can have entrepreneurship where actually you intimately engage in a very agile, flexible way with a group of people who you might envision to be a particular consumer group or a particular user group, in order to kind of not necessarily show them particular examples of your designs, but to kind of explore particular issues that maybe, or to talk with them about particular problems that are related to maybe a proposition that you're coming up with. But certainly in the context of the type of work that I do, really, I guess the design thinking process isn't about actually working with a particular group or a particular set of users or project team to come up with a good idea which we then collectively come up with. But quite often it's about working with a particular set of, in research terms we call them participants anyway, working with a group of participants, for them to start exploring themselves actually what potential challenges are that they have in their lives or the lives of the other people that maybe might be taking part in the workshops that I've arranged, to start to think about what the potential solutions are to addressing those problems. And very often there's been examples then from the work which I've done, where through starting to learn basic design techniques by using some of the templates that I talked about before, but also other types of very lightweight prototyping activities like the lo-fi drawings that you talked about a moment ago, they start to realize themselves that actually there's something that they could propose here instead to counter the types of stuff that already exist. So for me, really, for the type of work that I do, I would say actually, the role here might be the role of design thinking, as I talk about it in the context of entrepreneurship, is to actually support people that maybe don't think of themselves as entrepreneurs to start to explore ideas and get things off the ground in the first place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense. Sam, did you also want to say something?
Yeah, I was just like all of this kind of conversation around there's kind of new ideas and new collaboration that Tim Brown is talking about. I was reading the other day about how we tend to think of things that we can do in the form of kind of products, and this is actually kind of a problem in sustainability where I work. Is it's called this modernist perspective. We tend to think of things in terms of things that we can produce, and I'm just kind of wondering to what extent the kind of business approach is affecting how we design for new groups. And yeah, it wasn't a really well fleshed out question. It's just kind of some thoughts.
Well, I guess I think you're completely right. I mean, sustainability in itself is a really fantastic example of an area where design thinking has tried to be introduced, and there's been some kind of tension points, primarily because it's a huge, massive systemic problem, and there's a great realization that so in a lot of sustainability research, particularly around technology design, there's a huge emphasis on behavior change, and actually designing more things to give to people to change their behavior so that they are more sustainable or more ecologically friendly. And actually, there's a huge counter argument that what there needs to be is a much more holistic, wide-ranged cultural shift, so that it's not good enough for a few thousand or even a few million people to change their behaviors and their practices. But actually, we need entire organisations, entire governments, entire new policies to be introduced to kind of change these. And again, that relates to the issue I talked about earlier about how that means getting a lot of politics and actors to run to see eye to eye, and that's actually then you stop talking about things at all, and you talk about attitudes and negotiation, belief systems, and all sorts of things. But to kind of respond to kind of your point around objects and things, certainly in the field of design over the last 10 years, and Tim Brown doesn't necessarily touch on this explicitly, but I think it's what he's getting at. It's been a massive shift from designing just for objects and for artifacts to designing for services that surround those objects and artifacts instead. So it's thinking about the whole. So you can think of in terms of touch points. So when does someone, rather than thinking about how people interact with a specific object, what's the first point of someone even hearing about a particular product or a service that you're offering? How would they then? How have they come into contact with it? Is it through word of mouth? Have they seen advertising material? How do they then follow how do they then first get in contact with your service? And then what that starts to do, although you're still thinking in terms of actual things like connecting to each other rather than just a single thing, you then start to think much more about people's experiences of a certain product as a process, and having an entry point that kind of changes over time and it ebbs and flows. And I think that's then when you start to get an entry point to thinking about these kinds of challenges on a much bigger scale than how we do at the moment.
I have a practical question actually, because I guess both I have received lots of feedback from everyone taking this course about the mobile design, about the desktop design, and then Ryan, who's on this call too, actually just sent a request for feedback on a product that he is building, and we've had like a few back and forth emails about it. And what really comes out is that sometimes your users who you're inviting to participate in your design disagree with you, and they feel very strongly about it. Like, how do you then kind of reconcile all of these views of all the different people in the vision of a designer? What's your role as a designer? Are you just a mediator taking averages and, you know, doing I don't know, like some dialogue analysis of everything that people think, well, don't even think that they're saying, but, you know, just, you know, doing some sort of quantitative approach to qualitative data? Like, how do you make sense out of what people tell you your product or solution or system should be?
Yeah. So you're going to hate me here because there's kind of like no real simple direct answer to that question. In fact, well, for me anyway. But it sounds like a real common challenge that practically anyone who's kind of developing a new system or product would have. I think, so one of the things that you think about, so coming back to kind of design thinking, what a lot of design thinking processes are is it is a negotiation between a range of different, often quite conflicting things that you have to kind of always juggle. And one of those is, first of all, kind of the feasibility of a new product and a new system. So actually, is it entirely feasible to get something up and running with, you know, existing technologies, with other things that it might plug into? Is there kind of a customer base? Is there like a user need, you know, financially, if it's something that you're trying to sell? You know, is there actually a group of people out there with the money that would be willing to buy it? Or alternatively, are there people that will buy it for other people to use? And often then there might be a tension point there between actually what is feasible or feasible within a certain time span, and then actually, you know, what people want. And then there's the whole issue of kind of what you believe to be the right thing and what you think a brand's identity is. And I think the point is, I mean, if you were doing it for research, so, you know, I'm primarily a researcher, so I am very interested in people moaning about design propositions and critiquing them, and, you know, I can write lots of lovely papers about that because you get lots of quotes, you do really interesting qualitative analysis. But it's, practically speaking, when you're doing that type of work, what you kind of have to do is have a feeling through process of really, if people are articulating a very, very strong desire not to go in a certain direction, does this seem to be driven by maybe a very strong personal belief that this person has? Is it articulated by a deep frustration with, for example, if you're designing on at a simple level a specific interface, is it like a deep frustration with, you know, the ways in which the user interface is being laid out or whatnot? Or actually, is there like a bigger picture thing here where actually, although they seem to be arguing in favour or against a particular set of features or a particular set of services, in reality they're saying other things that might contradict that, and you think actually you can still push this thing through and it would still use. So I think it's kind of the sort of things you can do there is kind of, first of all, you have to kind of balance these trade-offs all the time between what's feasible, what you think the right thing is to do in terms of a particular brand identity, and then actually what people say. And then, you know, if you are having quite deep engagements with, say, a particular group of customers or with a user base, is there a way of kind of looking at how the things they say change over time, and are they contradicting with other things, and always use these as ways in which to kind of think through any of the decisions that you might be making. But there's no mathematical formula to anything like that, I'm afraid. People try to make up mathematical formulas for that sort of trade-off process, but they typically fail.
And you know, here actually, I guess a follow-up question, because not so much mathematical but technological. Mm-hmm. fascinated, from what you've talked about. Like one of the main issues with participatory design and implementing large-scale design thinking processes is because A, there's like politics, and two, it seems to me that there is a difficulty getting meaningful feedback in an organized way. And this actually gets me thinking about the process of kind of democratic decision making and new models of democracy using technology, such as liquid democracy, or kind of kind of splitting your vote per issue, so giving one person a vote on an issue that you think they have a good position on, but then giving another vote for another person that has a different opinion. And I guess as someone who works very closely with these systems, what do you think are the most interesting things happening in that space? What do you think works best based on the research that you have done, and what are some limitations?
So do you mean in terms of that level of democracy more generally, or do you mean in the context of, say, a design process?
See, I guess I think of everything in terms of design. You're either designing how a country is going to work, how the environmental department is going to do their 10-year plan, or you're designing a cup. Like for me, it's just the process of the complexity of feedback that these tasks require. But to some extent, I look at all of them as design tasks. So please feel free to say, for complex issues, for simple issues, that it's a different solution. But I guess overall, with problem solving, like what are some of the most interesting models of effective problem solving in a kind of democratic way that you're aware of that exist?
Well, I suppose one thing I'd like to draw upon a little bit is the experience of one of my colleagues here, who one of our PhD students, who has developed a system called Ballot Share, which is really, so this is Vasilis, whose surname I will not try to pronounce because I would embarrass myself. Because he's Greek, so apologise to any Greek people on the air here. He might be right behind Sam actually. But also, the reason why I think what he did was interesting. So just to give the context, his research is all around local democracy, and kind of really quite a lot of it pretty mundane forms of decision making. So it's looking at technologies to kind of lower the barrier of participation in democratic processes and in voting processes, really. And he's actually developed what equates to really a social media platform, which gives people who might live in a specific physical area a certain number of credits and coins to spend on ballots, which are set for them to kind of respond to. So we've used it actually on really, really boring things in our research group to kind of determine where we go to the pub on a Friday evening, through to what the name of our new research laboratory was going to be when it opened a couple of months ago.
That wasn't a democratic process either.
There wasn't a particularly democratic process. No, Sam, you're right there. But actually, the other things that are really interesting, it's been used on streets to kind of have discussions between residents on consultations for kind of changes to traffic layouts and things like that. And the reason why it's interesting is, first of all, it's completely transparent, so you can kind of anyone who's within the system can see who's online, who's kind of voting for what. You can also have conversations, obviously, as it's a social media platform, about what's going on in terms of the vote. But I think probably the more interesting features of it are the fact that, like you're saying with the kind of liquid democracy, Hannah, is that you can kind of have weighted votes, so you can vote a certain number of your coins on one thing, but you can also vote them on other things as well if there's a specific quality of a response that you prefer. You can add new poll options if none of the ones that have already been introduced kind of meet the response that you'd like to give. You can also exchange your coins to other people. So, for example, if there's a specific poll going on in a particular street, but one question might be around the traffic layout down one end of the street, but you only really care about your end of the street. You can actually exchange it with people that live the other end of the road, with the hope that they might give something back to you a bit further down the line, when there's something that's more important on your doorstep to vote for. So for me, what's really interesting is it plays around the normal kind of single vote model black box of democracy, that you walk into a booth and put something pink on a slip and shove it in a box never to be seen again. The fact that there's a whole dialogue around it as well clearly speaks to my own personal values of doing participation and democratic forms of design. But I think it's all these interesting capabilities of being able to exchange votes with other people, being able to actually weight your votes in one way or another, and actually actively, another interesting feature of that he's kind of exploring is actively voting down certain options as well, and people being able to see that you vote down certain options over others. And then so that's kind of an implicit design process. I think how that gets used, it's making decisions about your local area, or making decisions about what pubs we might go to on a Friday night, but also we've been exploring how you might use those types of systems as well in kind of more explicitly design processes. So over the course of a project where we might be developing a new form of financial service, bringing in groups of people to run workshops and to explore different systems that we're using, and actually using tools like this as a way of capturing feedback from those people that have participated in the session, about where they think the development cycle should be prioritised going forward. So that's the sort of things that I think is quite interesting.
Cool.
I've put the links to the things John was talking about in the chat.
Yeah. I just opened the one about Tennyson.
And I suppose the reason why I think some things like that are particularly important is because quite often they deal with, because they're talking about quite mundane things and quite everyday things that people for people to talk about. Actually, they're things that people really care about. And they're things that can seem very local and concrete. You can actually understand them and make sense of them. And I think often, particularly when you think of democratic processes, and we think of government, even government within like a local council scale, they seem like a massive black box. It's something that you could never really reach to. And how can we really impact on decisions that have been made in a massive house full of lords in Westminster? Whereas actually, things like this, where you're actually having a meaningful dialogue with people in the same place where you live, or perhaps that you've all met at an individual workshop and you've had a chat about a particular set of problems in your local area, I think that makes it really meaningful, and you actually start to get a sense that there can be some meaningful action here as well, and we can actually do something about it. For me, anyway.
Cool.
Sorry, rant over.
No worries. I've been stealing the question space. Does anyone else have questions? You can ask John about anything. So this includes any of the interesting previous projects that he has done, and I guess that would be my next question. But let's get on to this. But I see we have Andres who joined us, and he contributed some great ideas during our weekly discussion session last week, so maybe he also has some questions for you. And Ryan, let me know if you have any that could potentially be helpful to your work as a designer right now. And Lara, James, Sam, if you have any questions, that'd be good too. Okay, Andres is saying that he doesn't because he joined a bit later and not too prepared. Okay, well I can just go on to be honest. So my next question was going to be around you said that you were designing a tech interface for personal finances for older people, and how was that experience different? What is it that that they perceive or or think of differently, because this basically makes me think of the because I'm sure that you didn't get my comment about bird to the left, bird to the right in my today's email, but actually what Matt was talking about there is that his 3-year-old child was asking where are all the bears as they were driving through Finland, because and then they realized actually that the navigator was saying bird to the right, bird to the left, and the poor child was, you know, looking left and right for bears, and they were nowhere to be seen. So is there anything of that kind that, you know, it's just something that you couldn't think about, even if you thought about this for a year, that this is how people will be, you know, or people of a different age will be perceiving the interface of a product, of a solution that you're proposing. So what were some of such experiences in your work with other people?
Well, I have to say, like, I mean, I say this as someone who's done like research of older people now for like 10 years or however long. And as someone who does a lot of research in the field of like human computer interaction, you know, so obviously I'm really interested in technology and making gadgets and gizmos. It's really, it can be a very heart-shattering and demoralizing experience working with older people, because, you know, the standard quote of any workshop or interview I'd have is like, oh, you're so smart, love, you're so smart, but it's not for me. It's not for me, you know. And, you know, there's always a sense of complete and utter, for the vast majority of people, and you can't say this for everyone, of course, of satisfaction with where they are in life. And there's no need, when you feel almost as though, if you feel as though you've only got 10, 15, even 20 years, potentially 30 years, who knows how old we could live to, left you in life. More often than not, there's a sense of actually you've got to the point of where you are in life. You do not need any clutter, any more objects, any more gadgets or gizmos in and around your home. Although having said that, you know, more often than not, having done a workshop with me, they suddenly feel as though they do need lots more gadgets and gizmos, and that makes me feel like I have somewhat more of a purpose in life. But actually, I think one of the more interesting and perhaps more subtle things that I've kind of come across, and I think the banking project was a really good example of that, was how, particularly for an existing generation of 70 to 80 or 90-year-olds, you know, these are people that would have lived through the Second World War, you know, in the UK anyway, and they very much have a mentality of make, do, and mend, and very much also a mentality of not wanting to spend more than what they have. So even if they have a lot of savings in their bank account, an awful lot of the people that I've met over the years wouldn't actually spend that, because there's always the feeling of you're saving money for a rainy day, or you're saving money for when your pension's going to dry out, or even when there's going to be some sort of crisis, or it's to be passed on to other family members. And this obviously has a huge impact on the kind of the decisions they make in terms of actually the types of gadgets, types of technologies, the types of services that they might buy into. But in the context of the project that I did around financial technologies, what it came out as was as a deep, huge resentment to consumerist society in general, and a real resentment towards bankers and banks and financial institutions. Primarily because when we did the project, it was because it was around the same time as the credit crisis, and these are all people that had spent 60 years saving up there, putting money into their savings accounts, which suddenly became pretty meaningless and inaccessible to them, and weren't really earning much more money. So for me, it's kind of how you start to really realise how technology and consumerism, and certainly this perception that an awful lot of, from a lot of older people anyway, that a lot of technologies are designed for younger people and designed to kind of support quite individualistic and pretty meaningless experiences that actually are really only of the moment and don't have really any lasting impact on anyone's lives. That's the sort of thing that really, really comes up really hugely and very strongly. That said, of course, I've also done lots of more useful projects with them as well, where we've come up with technologies with them where they actually very quickly start to realise, by learning a few of the things that you can do with technology and some of the opportunities that it provides, that there are ways in which that it can be appropriated and used in ways that actually is ethically responsible, is moral, and all sorts of things. But the lasting legacy, I think, of all my work that I've done with older people is always getting over that initial resentment towards the fact that technology exists kind of in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we have a question.
Yeah, we have a question, and then we have an anecdote from Sam. Sam, do you think that the anecdote is short?
It's very short.
Yeah. Okay. Go.
So it's also in contrast to the next question, but in terms of not being sober or ceremonial. So I was right. The comments about commercialism reminded me about something my grandfather said to me, which was, you can't take it with it. You can't take it all with you when you go. He said he was going to break that by having pockets sewn into his shroud. That was all.
A beautiful anecdote, Sam.
Yeah. No, that's no, but I mean, I have to say, I really like this anti-materialist approach. And I wonder, at what age do people hit that spot where they're like, I don't want any more things, and I, just don't need any new technology, and what else do you do then?
Well, I feel as though I've been there since I was about 18 already, so maybe I'm just tight.
No, that's I guess that's true. Actually, yeah. Well, about being anti-materialist, I also have a funny anecdote. I guess from a friend who had all of her shoes stolen from her flat, like beautiful designer shoes, and her response to this was, I feel like I've been so materialistic. I should no longer be as materialistic. I've been so inspired. I'm gonna go and I'm gonna get myself a bonsai tree to remind me of this. Yeah, it's yeah. But coming back to James's question, which is, it's all nice and good that you can contribute to making small decision making at your local level for things that you actually care about. But do you actually require some level of sobriety and ceremony while having a big election that will change everything for the next 5 years? And if you make a big mistake, like Poland has just done in the presidential election, then you have to deal with it for the next few years. How do you think about that? Like, basically, like, what's the culture of elections? Like, should there be some level of ceremony around it?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just reading through. Oh, he's gone. Okay. That's a humongous question. I feel as though I'm being dragged into a response which is like, how can design thinking solve democracy or solve government? So does there need to be a huge amount of ceremony and pomp? I guess I'm interpreting that as does there need to be like a huge grand sense of pomp around, there's this thing that we're all working towards, and we can all engage in this one act on this one day to kind of go and vote and make this huge decision for the next 5 years, to kind of make, which will have a huge impact on potentially on ourselves. So yes, I guess certainly going out of the hyper local sense, then that is needed. So this is why I need to really kind of say that I'm no means a expert on democratic decision making at the scale of national, even international governance. But certainly talking from my own particular experiences, on a lot of the projects that I've done that contrast kind of national democracy and national governance with kind of local government, I think often the feeling is that even if you were to have this ceremonial moment where you all are contributing towards a specific decision on a national scale, there's a real sense of disconnection about what that might actually mean. And I have no real answer in terms of thinking about how we can go about it. But I was really struck just last week as part of a project I was working with. I was interviewing some people at a social housing provider who have been doing some engagements with a really impoverished and stigmatized street, actually, within their area which they manage, with some residents who, for various reasons, have got problems with things that have been happening in the local area. And what was really fun was we were talking about what a community means and what people feel a community means. And often when we think of, community is quite an abstract term anyway, but I think it's kind of useful because it means that's kind of what I identify with. And I guess a community can be something that's in a very bounded geographical area. It could be other people that I might be identifying with for whatever reason. And it was really interesting how it turned about that a lot of these residents' angst with their local area was because it seems as though their sense of community wasn't at the scale of a neighbourhood, but it wasn't at the scale of the town within which they lived in, and it wasn't even at the scale of the streets around their houses. It was their sense of community was the street, and that meant that to them, even though they had a sports centre a 5-minute walk away, even though they had a playing field about a 2.5-minute walk behind houses, and they had a park the other side which had a playing area for their children, they were absolutely steadfast in their argument that they had no local facilities provided to them whatsoever. Even though these would be pointed out to them, it'd be like, well, that's for those people, that's for that people. There's nothing here for us. And I think, kind of in a way, even if you have, the biggest pomp and these huge ceremonies and these huge referendums that we might be contributing towards, I can't help but feel that there's always going to be that sense for a lot of people of huge disconnection between what they think is their world and their community, and actually what impacts upon them, and actually what goes on in different places. Now, actually, how do you respond to that? I haven't got a clue whatsoever, I'm afraid. But I suppose the ways in which you can start doing that is, first of all, providing greater ways of, or easier ways, lowering the barriers to actually participating in democratic processes in the first place. Perhaps feeding it in at a much earlier age to allow people to understand the impact these processes might have on their own lives. So I know that's not really an answer whatsoever, but I guess I agree with the point being made, but I don't necessarily have a challenging.
No, it's perfectly okay. I mean, I think it's very interesting because from our discussion, and I guess from my own thinking around this, is that it's much easier to tackle all issues at a local level. And I frequently ask myself, why do we need to have such huge consolidation of power and decision making at a central national level, where there's just no way that you can find the right solution for everything, for everyone? You need some basic guidance. Obviously, you need a defense system, but in terms of solving issues, I often think that communities do that much much better. And I mean, the example that comes to my mind, and I can see that we're running out of time and we've been losing participants, which is probably explained by the fact that we are. But the one example that I have in mind is having to do with Amazon forest, where, you know, if you try to have a regional solution to, yes, no one is going to cut down the forest in the Amazon, it doesn't really work, because everyone else assumes that the other person is bluffing and will continue doing it. So then they just take a chance and they do it themselves. Whilst if you focus on giving a chunk of a forest to a local community to do with it as they please, the results of not getting as much deforestation have actually been much better, because once the communities see that something belongs to them and they have to take care of it, they make far better rational decisions that really respond to the interests of the people who will be using like a good or a service. But I don't want to make like a, I guess, wider swiping political generalization about this, but that at least has been my experience, that I just don't understand why so many issues we try to tackle them at a national level, even if or a much larger level.
I suppose that I suppose the point almost been made as well earlier is how in order to engage in these types of decision-making process, there should be a certain level of effort and friction almost designed into them. In a way, you want people to really think through these decisions, and in a way, making it simpler for them. Making it simpler for people, can have negative consequences as well, because you can go through and you can make loads of decisions which aren't necessarily fully thought out and might have huge implications. But I would say, although there's an element of that's true, there's a huge percentage of the electorate in the UK anyway who simply do not engage with it whatsoever. So in a way, their votes kind of just being completely, or their voices being completely discounted and isolated anyway, and possibly it would take generations to kind of transform that, or really a hugely monumental and influential decision that needs to be made in order to actually bring those people out. So I think making it easier now, and perhaps filtering that through for future generations, and giving them the knowledge and the understanding, I think that would be for me, that's kind of the critical starting point.
No, it's
and doing it at a local level just completely makes sense for doing that.
Yeah, it's very interesting how we spoke about design and then design thinking, and from there we kind of ventured on to this process to discuss the politics of this process, the mechanics of the process of decision making. Because I do think that these issues are incredibly interconnected, and it's always like an interesting thing to consider or to debate, whether it's better to have one person with an idea and then the rest just follows, or to actually get the inputs to then figure out what is the best idea, so that you don't just go forward with this basically the weight of automatic agreement of most people who just don't care to even give you an opinion about something. And I will conveniently say, I'm not ignoring the question about the suitcase full of coat hangers and some pancreas and my own view on material things. I just have no idea what he's referring to. So that's I'm just gonna leave it at this. I think, though, I guess to just like end on an anecdote. James was always making fun of me that all women or all people, in fact, they always like things in a store that looks like something that they already own, as a kind of implicit way of asking for a compliment. Like if you ask for opinion, do you like this? You basically get a compliment because you know that you already own something that's very similar. But from then on, I actually got to a point where I acknowledged that was in fact the case, and I just started buying the exact same copies of clothes that I already own. So I guess that's one of the views on material possessions that I have, is that I own 6 pairs of the exact same pens because I just like them, and that's okay. So. Anyway, thanks so much.
Oh, thank you
for the amazing chat about design, politics, decision making, etc. Oh, there's actually so we have a question from Andres, if you don't mind, the extra 5 minutes. So here in Latin America, there's a huge amount of poverty. Technology usually needs to be the least complicated and easiest to use as possible, because of the low level of education and lack of access to technology. But at the same time, it's clear that younger people want technology, and older people are reluctant to keep up with it. So I guess the question is, how did you end up resolving? How did you end up getting older people to use technology to get banking services? Because you did mention that after your sessions, they did want to have a gizmo.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. So we didn't really. I suppose this is another example of the power of doing this kind of participatory design, and I guess politically engaged type of design research as well. So to give a bit more context to that project, it was occurring at the time when the banking organisations in the UK were going to withdraw cheques. So, cheques, paper, not an actual bill, but methods of making payments by filling out who you want to pay, what their bank account details are, signing it off, and just posting it over to them. Obviously, this is by banking infrastructure terms, an ancient technology now. It's a piece of paper that you send to someone. It has to be more often than not manually processed by another person at the other end, or at least it does in the UK. So our project, although actually to begin with it was nothing to do with the withdrawal of cheques from circulation, it was more around issues to do with making payments generally and access to savings and pensions and whatnot. Because this got introduced during us doing the workshops with our participants, it actually completely changed the whole direction of the project. And before this was announced, we'd been having we've been doing lots of workshops around the physicality of cash compared to the kind of the ephemeral, intangible nature of digital technologies, and how actually having physical money was a useful way of just understanding how you could budget your finances and how much you could put aside on particular pots of money. And it seemed to a lot of the people that were taking part in our project that actually cheques was another example of that, because with a checkbook, you can write a specific amount, you can send it to a specific person. A lot of them talked around how it felt very safe and secure, because you knew you were writing it to a specific person that you also imagined to know. You signed it, and even though actually, in terms of literal security, a cheque is very, very insecure, in terms of how our participants experienced it, it was like the most secure type of transaction they could ever make, because you put it in an envelope, and of course it's going to end up on the desk of the person that you're sending it to, so of course it's perfectly safe, nothing can go wrong there. So we actually spent a lot of time kind of talking around why this relatively ancient technology was seen to be so privileged by a lot of our participants. And in the end, the ways in which it really affected our project was in two key ways. The main one was that actually, rather than designing and prototyping new technologies with them to replace cheques, we started instead to look at the ways in which we might put a digitally mediated service in place, which actually would allow cheques to still be used once the banks had got rid of them. So we actually, over the course of a few months, designed a service where people could purchase their own checkbooks from an organisation that was essentially a charity that held its own banking license, and you could buy a checkbook which would be up to a certain amount of money. So you could get a checkbook which was maybe up to £100, and then you can use it to make certain types of transactions. And it's worth saying the types of transactions that a lot of our participants in this project were using checks for were things like paying their milkman on their doorstep, or paying the window cleaner, or paying a friend to go and get some shopping for them if they were housebound. And actually, these are very little things, but if they didn't have any access to cash, there was absolutely no way for them to make these purchases. And certainly if you're housebound, that literally means you don't get any food in your house. So it really, really kind of limits you. So, the types of transactions were not huge. So a pay-as-you-go checkbook would be something that they could use. And then actually what we developed then was a very quite elaborate system that used what was then a very novel crowdsourcing technique to scan a check at a physical location nearby. So you could literally post this off to someone. It goes to a kind of an area within the local region which kind of houses all these checks, which in our case was actually our university. And then we scanned the checks, and then using Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is like a crowdsourcing platform, we designed a task where crowd workers could actually process the check for us. And it meant actually our checks, when we were up and running and using, could be processed within 3 days, which was 2 days faster than actual checks. And it meant essentially that as far as the people that were using the checks were concerned, they were still writing a check completely as they were normally. It was something they were absolutely familiar with. The only thing they had to do differently was they had to write on the side of their check how much money they'd spent from a particular book, because it was like a pay-as-you-go kind of financial model. So in a way, I guess to answer that question, the way in which to kind of get around the issue of reluctance is not, rather than replacing the things that people might be using already or relying on with technology, think of how technology might be able to preserve some of its qualities and perhaps simplify existing processes in the back end and make things more efficient to process, because our checks were actually significantly cheaper to process than a normal check clearing process was. It's worth saying the second part of the project that all of this work affected was the fact that we had a lot of useful kind of workshop transcripts which kind of evidenced why checks should be still in existence. And we did a lot of policy work with central government and with the Payments Council, who make decisions around what types of payment services are available in the UK. And in the end, the plan to withdraw them was overturned. And they're still in existence. So that's why our check process never actually took off, because we were too good on the other bit. But yeah.
Now I just understood why I have to pay my UK tax by check, because I was actually I was actually wondering how on earth do we still have checks? Like, this option shouldn't exist. And here we go. I just found my answer. Thank you very much, John.
It's a very peculiar British thing. The only thing I will say is our check service is a lot more advanced than the American one, but that's not necessarily saying anything. But yeah. Sorry.
All right. Thank you so much for this amazing chat, and for sharing your project, your work, your research, your ideas. And yeah, well, I guess that's our final week, so don't forget about the weekly session. I'm actually thinking about trying to reschedule it, just to get like a sense, would either Wednesday or Friday work for people?
Wednesday is better than Friday.
Oh, okay.
And Friday is better than Wednesday?
Yeah, I have a deadline tomorrow night, so that's not going to happen.
Okay, Andres says Friday. Okay, Friday works reasonably well for me, so I think that I'll just try rescheduling to Friday, and I hope that Brian can also make it. Great, so I'll send an email out about that, and thanks so much for for everything. Bye bye.
See you, everyone.